The moment my ex-husband slid the divorce papers across the polished conference table, he leaned back with a smug smile and said, "The house, the car, it's all mine now." My lawyer turned toward me, almost pleading. "Don't sign. We can fight this," but I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't even look at my ex. I calmly picked up the pen and signed every page, while he watched with open satisfaction, convinced he'd broken me. He laughed as he gathered the documents, already talking about remodeling his house and taking a weekend drive in his new car. Every word echoed through the silent office like a victory speech. The only sound I focused on was the soft click of my pen returning to the table. People mistook my silence for surrender. They couldn't see what I saw. I noticed the confidence in his eyes, the greed hiding behind his grin, and the certainty that he'd won everything worth having. As we walked out of the courthouse, he celebrated with friends in the parking lot while I drove away in an old rental car, looking exactly like the defeated ex-wife everyone expected me to be. What none of them understood was that I hadn't signed because I was powerless. I signed because I already knew something he didn't. And within days, the truth about that perfect property would wipe the smile off his face forever. My name is Claire, and for 12 years, I believed that keeping a marriage together meant sacrificing quietly. I handled the mortgage payments, managed our finances, and worked long hours as a commercial real estate consultant while my husband, Daniel, chased one business idea after another. Whenever his plans failed, I was the one who absorbed the financial damage without complaint. From the outside, people saw a confident couple living comfortably. Behind closed doors, I had become the steady foundation that no one noticed, until it was taken for granted. Daniel had a talent for making confidence sound like competence. He loved taking credit for things he barely understood, especially when other people were watching. If a financial decision worked out, he called it his vision. If it failed, he quietly let me solve the problem while protecting his pride. Over time, I stopped correcting him, not because I agreed, but because I had learned that peace often costs less than another pointless argument. His friends admired him. Mine wondered why I always looked exhausted. I smiled through family dinners, celebrated his small victories, and ignored the growing feeling that I had disappeared inside my own marriage. Every compromise felt temporary, yet somehow years passed that way. What Daniel never realized was that I documented everything. Every payment, every contract, every conversation involving our investments was carefully organized. It wasn't because I expected revenge one day. It was simply the habit of someone who understood that facts outlast emotions. When he asked for the divorce, he acted as though he was finally freeing himself from a burden. In reality, he was walking away from the one person who had quietly protected him from the consequences of his own decisions. By the time those divorce papers landed on the table, everyone assumed I was the weaker one. They saw a calm woman who didn't argue, didn't beg, and didn't fight. None of them understood that silence can look exactly like surrender. Right before the truth changes everything. After filing for divorce, Daniel stopped pretending to be respectful. The small acts of kindness he had once performed for appearances disappeared overnight, replaced by quiet displays of arrogance that seemed designed to remind me I no longer belonged in the life we had built together. Whenever we met to discuss paperwork, he arrived wearing an expensive suit he couldn't really afford, smiling as though the future had already rewarded him. He spoke to me with the careful politeness people reserve for strangers. But every sentence carried a hidden edge. "You'll figure something out," he would say with a casual shrug, as if rebuilding an entire life were nothing more than crossing an item off a checklist. His attorney often glanced toward me, waiting for an emotional reaction that never came. Daniel seemed disappointed every time I simply nodded and answered in a calm voice. He wanted anger. He wanted tears. Silence denied him both. One afternoon, while we walked through the house to document its contents, he ran his hand across the kitchen island and smiled. "I'll probably renovate this first," he said, already talking about paint colors and new furniture as though I had vanished from the conversation. I looked around the room instead. Sunlight poured through the windows, illuminating every corner I had carefully designed over the years. I remembered choosing the flooring, negotiating with contractors, and reviewing every invoice while Daniel proudly told friends it had all been his idea. The disrespect wasn't loud. It lived in the little moments. He interrupted me during meetings. He thanked everyone except me for work I had done. When mutual friends asked how I was coping, he answered before I could speak, wearing a sympathetic, smile that made him look generous while quietly painting me as fragile. Most people believed him because confidence is persuasive. What they couldn't see was that Daniel had become so obsessed with celebrating what he thought he had won that he stopped paying attention to the details, and details had always been where the truth lived. The turning point didn't come during a courtroom hearing or a heated argument. It arrived in complete silence a week after the divorce was finalized. When my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately, it was the attorney who had handled the purchase of our house years earlier. He wasn't calling to congratulate me or offer sympathy. He simply asked whether Daniel had contacted me about the ownership transfer that had been triggered after the divorce decree. When I told him no, there was a long pause before he quietly said, "I thought he understood what he was receiving." That sentence confirmed what I had suspected all along. Years earlier, when we purchased the property, I had insisted on a legal structure that protected my family's investment. My parents had contributed most of the down payment, and their attorney recommended an agreement that kept the title subject to specific financial obligations and ownership conditions. Daniel had barely skimmed the documents before signing them. He trusted me to handle the boring paperwork, just as he always had. Back then, I wasn't planning for revenge. I was planning for responsibility. Now, that same responsibility had become the difference between appearance and reality. Daniel had fought so hard to win the house that he never stopped to understand everything attached to it. He saw the address, the driveway, and the market value. I saw contracts, obligations, and legal clauses. For the first time since the divorce, I allowed myself a quiet smile. I didn't need to expose him or embarrass him. The documents would do that without raising their voice. My lawyer had once asked why I signed so easily. Now I finally had an answer. Because I knew the greatest mistake Daniel would ever make wasn't divorcing me. It was believing that ownership belonged to the person holding the keys instead of the person who understood the paperwork. I resisted every temptation to call Daniel or warn him. There was nothing left to argue about, and certainly nothing left to prove. The paperwork would unfold exactly as it had been written years ago. My role was simply to make sure every legal step happened on schedule. As a commercial real estate consultant, I had spent more than a decade reviewing contracts that most people barely glanced at. I knew that a single overlooked clause could change the meaning of an entire agreement. That experience had taught me an important lesson. Confidence wins conversations, but documentation wins outcomes. I scheduled a meeting with my attorney and the property attorney who had overseen the original purchase. Together, we reviewed every deed: mortgage record, trust document, and ownership agreement. Nothing had been overlooked. The provisions protecting my family's contribution were valid, enforceable, and already recorded long before Daniel filed for divorce. There was no secret loophole and no trick. Everything had been disclosed from the beginning. Daniel simply never considered that the documents he had dismissed as routine paperwork would one day determine his future. My attorney prepared the required notices and confirmed that the ownership conditions would now be enforced exactly as written. I authorized every filing with a simple signature, treating the process like any other professional transaction. There was no satisfaction in creating problems for someone else. The satisfaction came from knowing that the truth didn't need my emotions to defend it. Meanwhile, Daniel continued celebrating online. Friends congratulated him on winning everything, posting smiling photos in front of the house he believed was entirely his. I scrolled past them without reacting. Silence remained my greatest advantage. The more publicly he celebrated, the more painful the correction would become. Not because I planned it that way, but because reality has a way of arriving without asking whether anyone is ready. All I had to do was wait for the paperwork to reach him. The rest would happen exactly as the contracts had promised years before. 3 days later, the consequences arrived in a plain white envelope. Daniel received the official notice, requiring him to satisfy the ownership conditions attached to the property before the title could be transferred entirely into his name. If he couldn't meet those obligations within the specified time, the agreement required the property to be sold, with my family's protected investment returned first according to the recorded contracts. For the first time, confidence wasn't enough. I wasn't there when he opened the envelope, but I didn't need to be. My attorney called later that afternoon to tell me Daniel had spent nearly an hour insisting there had to be a mistake. He demanded meetings, requested copies of every document, and argued that no one had ever explained those conditions to him. The answer was simple. They had. He just hadn't listened. A few days later, we met one final time in a conference room that felt strangely familiar. The same polished table. The same quiet walls. Only this time, Daniel looked different. The certainty that had once filled the room had disappeared. He flipped through the documents one page at a time, stopping whenever he recognized his own signature at the bottom of another agreement. Every signature erased another excuse. Finally, he looked up and asked, almost in disbelief, "You knew this would happen?" I held his gaze for a moment before answering calmly. I knew what the contract said. There was nothing more to add. His lawyer quietly advised him that challenging the agreements would almost certainly fail. The documents were clear, properly executed, and legally recorded years before our divorce. The celebration he had enjoyed for days had been built on an assumption, not on facts. As I walked out of the building, I didn't feel victorious. I felt free. The greatest revenge wasn't watching Daniel lose what he thought he had won. It was realizing that the truth had defended me without ever needing me to raise my voice. News travels quickly when people have been celebrating too soon. Within a week, the same friends who had congratulated Daniel on winning everything were asking quiet questions instead. They weren't interested in gossip anymore. They wanted to understand how someone so confident could have misunderstood something so important. The answer was less dramatic than they expected. He hadn't been deceived, he had simply ignored the details because he believed confidence could replace careful attention. I didn't correct anyone's version of the story. I never posted online, never gave my side, and never tried to embarrass him. People reached their own conclusions after the legal documents became impossible to deny. Silence, once mistaken for weakness, gradually became the reason others trusted me more than ever. Professionally, nothing changed except my reputation grew stronger. Clients appreciated the same quality that had protected me through the divorce: patience. They knew I reviewed every contract carefully and never rushed important decisions. Ironically, the experience that Daniel had dismissed as boring paperwork became the very thing that earned me even greater respect. As for Daniel, the loss wasn't just financial. It was personal. For years, he had relied on appearances, assuming charm and certainty would carry him through every situation. This time, appearances couldn't rewrite signed agreements. The lesson arrived quietly, but it stayed. The divorce had taken away a marriage, but it gave me something I hadn't realized. I'd been missing for years, my own sense of peace. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I could sacrifice to keep someone else comfortable. Instead, I learned that protecting myself wasn't selfish. It was responsible. If there's one reason this story matters, it's because many people mistake silence for surrender. They assume the calmest person in the room has already lost. But life rarely rewards the loudest voice. More often, it rewards the person who stays composed, understands the facts, and lets the truth speak when the time is right. Months have passed since that final meeting, and my life has become quieter in the best possible way. The house was sold according to the legal agreement. My family's investment was returned exactly as the contracts required, and I used my share to purchase a smaller home, overlooking a peaceful lake just outside the city. It isn't as grand as the place Daniel fought so hard to keep, but every room feels like it belongs to me. For the first time in years, I wake up without the weight of someone else's expectations resting on my shoulders. I still work in commercial real estate, though my perspective has changed. Whenever a young couple sits across my desk signing papers, I encourage them to understand every document before they put pen to paper. Not because I expect their marriage to fail, but because respect begins with responsibility. Most of them thank me. A few even tell me they appreciate having someone who cares enough to explain the details. As for Daniel, I hear occasional updates through mutual acquaintances. He's moved to another city and started over. I don't wish him failure, and I don't celebrate his mistakes. Holding on to bitterness would only keep me tied to a chapter I've already finished. People sometimes ask whether I feel like I got revenge. I tell them the truth. Revenge wasn't the moment he realized he had misunderstood the contracts. Revenge wasn't watching his confidence disappear across a conference table. The real victory was discovering that I no longer needed his approval to recognize my own worth. Looking back, I understand something I couldn't see during our marriage. Silence is not weakness, patience is not surrender, and kindness should never require sacrificing your dignity. Some battles are won with louder voices. The most important ones are won by staying calm long enough for the truth to arrive. And in the end, the strongest person in the room wasn't the one who walked away believing they had taken everything. It was the one who walked away with nothing left to prove.